as they're wandering down from coffee and cookies. If you wish to pray with me, there's a prayer on top of your handout on the first page. I think I hear some people coming. We'll give them a minute.
Not picking you up.
Testing 1, 2, 3. I'm going to turn it off and on.
Yeah, reboot, I guess.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
When all else fails.
Turn it off and on. That's the first thing they tell you, right? Pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion in bonds of love and work through our struggles and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so we're talking about a gender, especially male and female roles. Last week we basically focused on 1 Corinthians, and there's a famous passage in there where Paul says something to the effect of, in a church, women should stay silent, but of course a couple chapters earlier he gave us instructions about how they should address when they get up front and speak. So we kind of had to ask what's going on, right? And what we saw was actually the idea that women shouldn't speak was the position he's arguing against. Right? That was what the people he's opposed to were saying. So today we're going to look at a couple other passages. We're going to focus a little bit still on women in leadership in the church, but then also we'll move into thinking about marriage, because we get these passages that talk about wives submitting to their husbands, and we're going to unpack some of that, right? I want to begin with, this is the first page of your handout. It's the end of the book of Romans. So I pretty much have all of Romans 16 on there. There's a couple things at the end I didn't include. These are biblical passages that most of us, when we read them, our eyes will glaze over. It's a list of names, right? So who are these? Why should we care about the names of these people who lived a long, long time ago, right? So this tells us that Paul's actually writing a letter in the ancient world, right? He's written, the book of Romans is long. It's the longest book in the New Testament after the Gospels and Acts, right? It's a long letter, but it takes the form of a typical letter in the ancient world, and you do your greetings at the end. So you can think of this if you're writing a letter to one of your siblings who lives on the other side of the world, you would say, hey, how's it going? You'd tell them some things, ask them some questions, and then you'd say, and greet your spouse and the kids and all these other people, right? So this is what he's doing. We've got this list here of other people, or people in particular who Paul wants to greet, right? And we learn some things. So the first person that gets mentioned here is a woman named Phoebe, right? This is why my daughter has this name. Some of you know who my daughter is, right? This is why we named her this, after this passage, actually. So Paul tells us, he says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is also a deacon. That's what she's called, right? We're gonna have to figure out what that term means. She's from a church in Cenchreae. Cenchreae is a suburb of Corinth. So Paul's in Corinth. This woman is part of a church that's in a suburb. So the big church in Corinth has planted a church in one of the suburbs. This is the church that she's in, right? And Paul is telling them to commend her. Why? Well, how did Paul's letter from Corinth get to Rome? Phoebe has it. So she's the one that he actually gave the letter to. She walked or got on a boat or on a horse or somehow and got from Corinth and Greece to Rome. It probably took a few months, right? So he's basically telling them, right, to welcome her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever manner she may have need of, for she has been a leader. We could also translate this, I guess, as patroness of many and of me myself. So we need to unpack some terms here. The first thing is she's called a deacon. She is not called a deaconess. So a Greek has, it's way more than English. If you know Spanish or maybe a German or a French, you know that most nouns in other languages have a case and a gender, right? So in Greek, every word is either a masculine word, a feminine word, or there's a neuter, right? The words have cases. Right, so we can see this in English words like actor and actress, or waiter and waitress, right? Though notice that increasingly we can use the masculine form for everybody. I can call a female who is a movie star an actor, and no one really cares anymore, right? Those feminine forms are kind of dropping out, right? But this isn't the case in the ancient world with a Greek. So deacon here is a title. He's not calling her just as her job. It's actually a title, like pastor. It's actually a better fit of what it is. So we use deacon in our church to talk about people who go visit shut-ins, right, or help other people, right. In the early church, this is more of the role of a pastor, right. The actual root of the word is a waiter. It's a person who waits on you at a table, right. But this is the idea of what they're doing. So she's actually playing some kind of a ministry role, right? She's actually probably doing things like preaching, right? And Paul has actually said, I want you to take my letter to Rome, and in fact, she's probably the one who reads it. So the way this would have worked in the ancient world, if I wrote a letter to a church, probably only 20% of the people in the church can actually read. Right. Literacy rates aren't high. So how do most people in that congregation hear it? Someone gets up front and reads it. This is also probably what Phoebe did, right? So first he calls her a deacon, and then at the end he calls her this word that I've translated a leader. Some of your Bibles will call it patroness, right? There's a reason for this. This word gets used a couple of times in the New Testament. Every other time it's used in the masculine case, or is used as a verb, and we translate it a leader or a ruler every time. So why, when it's used one time for a woman, do we translate it as something like patroness? Because we've already got this built-in assumption that if she's a woman, she's not a leader. Right? That's part of the problem here, is we take the biases that we have, we bring them to the text and assume, well, she can't possibly be a leader because she's a woman, so we'll have to have a different translation for it, right? But if we can put that bias aside, there's no good reason. This is a person in very high standing, holding a church office, right? Very, very early in the history of the church, right? So this is one thing we point to, right? If we go down a bit, we could meet these two people called Prisca and Aquila, right? Seems like a husband and wife team. Something really weird happens here. The woman's name is given first. So just like we do today, still, Christina and I get a mail all the time, right? With people like write letters to both of us. I'm just going to get to you something. It doesn't bother her, it bothers me. It annoys the heck out of me when we get things, and it's clearly for her, because it's from someone in a church or some official church thing, and my name is still first. Doesn't make any sense, right? What's happened here is actually the male and the female terms have gotten turned around. We might ask, well, why? Well, this is the ancient world, the ancient Roman world. This is probably a class thing. Here we probably have a woman named Prisca who comes from the highest class. She's basically a Roman elite, and she's married someone beneath her, probably a former slave. So the culture actually dictates she's still superior. So her name has to come first, right? So we're actually seeing this. There's some complicated things here. It isn't just about gender here in the ancient world. There's also all this class at play, right? They're called fellow workers, so Paul makes them equals, right? They risk their lives for him. He gives them thanks. So do all the churches, right? So we get all the, part of what I've highlighted in this passage is just all the names of women, right? It's still unequal. He gives 29 names here. 9 of them are names of women, right? But it does highlight that he's greeting people, all of whom are somehow leaders in the church, and at least close to a third of them are women, right? The takeaway is pretty obvious. Like in the very, very early church, when we're probably 30 years or so after Jesus has died, right? The church is trying to figure out how to lead and how to be organized. We've got all kinds of women leaders. It isn't until long afterwards that the church begins to sort of adopt the culture that's patriarchal. Early on, they're really countercultural. Right? They're quite opposed to the culture at large. We're going to come back to that. The even bigger one here comes in verse 7, where this is about as big as of a conspiracy theory you're ever going to hear me talk about. But there is a bit of a conspiracy theory here. So we get this woman named Junia. Again, it's probably a husband and wife team, and Andronicus and Junius, my fellow countrymen, my fellow prisoners. So they're Jewish, right? They're also in jail, and then he calls them both apostles. So that would be the highest possible title there is, right? An apostle in the Bible in the early church is a very technical term. It's an office, right? It's above, there's deacons and elders, or overseers, or bishops. It's above all of them, right? And what an apostle is someone who's had first-hand contact with Jesus. So in there, when they use the term, this is a person who actually knew Jesus on earth, right? The Apostle Paul elsewhere in the beginning of Galatians has to prove he's an apostle because he's an apostle in kind of a weird way. Because when does he actually encounter Jesus? Jesus appears to him and knocks him off his horse and blinds him, right? It's kind of and he's got an odd story. So there are people who think he isn't an apostle because earlier he was persecuting the Christians, right? So this is a big deal that a woman is called an apostle, right? So much so that beginning in about the 13th century, Bible scholars and theologians and church leaders began to say this person is a male. Because it is impossible that it could be a woman who's in that title office. But we've got Bible commentaries from the 3rd century and the 5th century and the 8th century, right before, and all of those they treat her as a woman, right? And I've got a big long footnote there that if you want to kind of unpack it, you can, but I'll explain it quickly. There's some confusion here. So again, if you know other languages, you know that they come in a case system. So if a word is a subject of a sentence, right? Like Matt goes to the store, my name would be in a different case. It would have to have a different ending on it if it's there or if it's at the end of a sentence, right? Meyer sold a chicken to a Matt. It would actually be, my name would be spelled different, depending on if it's a subject or an object, right? Again, if you know Spanish, if you ever studied Latin, right, you understand how this works, right? So, it is possible that this could be a masculine name. We have one reference in other literature where this is a masculine name. We have 250 instances of it being a woman's name. 250 to 1. So the chances are very good. It's a woman's name, right? And the fact that it's paired with a clear male name tells us this is probably a married couple, right? So this is a woman, again, being put into the highest office. So this boring kind of a list here of names actually tells us all kinds of things about who the early Christians were, right? And these are all people who Paul sees as your important leaders in Rome. I want to give you particular greetings, right? I just want to, that's the first thing I want to highlight. Any questions?
I'm going to teach a Latin class.
No. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's part of the problem is how do you preach a list of names, right? Right, but it's here, right? It's here in the Bible, and what it actually should inform us what's going on in the early church, and that's what it does. But it isn't necessarily a passage that we preach a sermon on. It's more of a passage we do in this kind of setting, right? Right. I mean, and again, this is part of my point. There's all these things in the Bible that we get to them and we're like, why is this here? Yeah. Right. Of how is this speaking to me devotionally? And there are just parts of the Bible that aren't devotional. They're informative. They tell us things that are happening. Yep.
The first time this passage kind of attracted my attention, I was sitting in jail waiting to be taken from Aldrich, Nebraska to Grand Island, Nebraska, because I had forgotten to pay the ticket. But I was reading, I was newly come back to the Lord. We were in the Jesus People movement, and we had a small group developing Bible study in the park, and some people hanging out in the house together and so on. And here I was sitting in jail reading this passage. And it really came to life for me. I said, well, that's the church.
Yep.
Now, we don't hear stuff like this going on in the big church down there with its walls and stuff.
Right.
They're not talking to each other this way. But this is the way we talk to each other in our Jesus People group.
Yep.
And it sort of verified for me the notion of an alternative to, well, I'd better not go there, to the institutional.
Well, I mean, there is something like that happening. I mean, and I think that's worth. I mean, this opens up a story, right? But I mean, this is part of what we do when we read the Bible, especially the New Testament. We really are reading. I mean, how they understand who Jesus is and what he did for us very early on. I mean, we really have a snapshot of about a 50-year period. If we think about there's, well, a little bit more. I mean, we get the Gospels that have the story of Jesus. It is worth pointing out, that's written down probably after what we're reading here. So the Gospels actually probably aren't written down for about 30 years after the events in them. These letters from Paul are actually earlier. So if you want to actually read the earliest Christian documents possible, it's Paul's letters, right? And the Gospels are actually probably written because the people who had that first-hand knowledge, the apostles, they were there, they saw Jesus do all these things, they're starting to die. Right? So we think the earliest gospel is Mark. We think it's written about the year 65, give or take 5 years, right? We can only get so close when things are this old, right? Well, if Jesus dies around the year 30, that's when he's crucified and raises from the dead, right? And let's say you're Peter and you're 25 years old, about the year 30. How old are you when it's now the year 65? You're pushing 60, maybe a little older, 70. And this is the ancient world, right? We don't have our high blood pressure meds and things like that, right? So I mean, this is when they're beginning to die, and that's why we actually get the Gospels, because it used to be, hey, I want to hear about Jesus. What would you do? You'd go talk to Peter. He'd tell you a story. But then when he begins to die, the people who were probably part of his intimate group wrote down all the things they heard him say and put it together into a book, right? And then we get other communities doing the same thing. So Mark is actually probably Peter's gospel, because we know Mark traveled with Peter. We get Matthew, one of Jesus' other disciples, Luke hangs out with Paul. This is actually Paul's understanding of Jesus, and then John is kind of its own thing. Right? But we get these Gospels, they're telling the story of Jesus. With the letters, we're getting sort of day-in activities of particular congregations, right? And in almost all of them, the person writing the letter, which is most often Paul, is irritated. I mean, this is the church that he planted. He left to go plant another one, and they're screwing it up. And he's got to basically say, no, you guys are doing it wrong. Right? That's part of what these letters are. So there actually are concrete letters written to concrete people dealing with concrete situations, right? And they're not in the same situation we always are. We still read them because we think God is speaking to us through these texts, right? But they're written to different people in a different time and place. We don't always have the same problems, right? But I just think it's worth pointing out, in a highly patriarchal society, they're doing something deeply countercultural, which is putting women into leadership roles. Can you hold on one second? But if you're going to do that, you actually have to sort of do it in a way that isn't going to attract too much attention, unwanted attention, which is why we get into things like we got into last week about don't wear your hair down, dress decently, right? Just because we're free now and we're going to put women into these roles, you can't flaunt all of society's norms, or it's actually going to cause problems for us. That's part of what Paul is doing. Okay.
I was just going to say, I think interesting that Phoebe is the first one you mentioned, woman. But the comment that struck me that I didn't really think of was that she was a leader of many and of
me. Yeah.
So either she was his teacher or his pastor or something.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it could very well be. I mean, this is, again, if we read the book of Acts, right? That's where we're really getting this very, very quick story of how did the church spread, and it focuses on different people. There's all kinds of churches established before Paul himself is a Christian. He's still persecuting Christians. So she could have been a Christian long before he was.
That's true.
Right? But they've got this team, and he does see, I mean, he's got some talent. He was very well trained. He becomes a leader quickly, and so she could have been his teacher at one point, but now he can actually tell her, I'd like you to go to Rome, right? So there's these kinds of things happening, right? So this is just wanted to highlight that. If we turn the page, I want to look at this passage from 1 Timothy. So this is probably the passage that gets cited the most by people who don't think women should be in leadership in a church, and also to talk about marriage and if marriage should be something of a hierarchy, right? And the key here is verses 11 and 12, right? And I've translated this, and I think in a little bit of a better way. If you go to like your King James version, or even something like the NIV, it's going to say something like, I don't allow women to have authority over a man. And usually that's in the sense of teaching, but it also gets applied to a marriage, right? So I've given the word there in Greek, authentane. It's the only time this word shows up in the entire New Testament. So that should tell us it's a technical word. It isn't used anywhere else. Anywhere else that we find it in ancient Greek literature, it has a sense of not merely to have authority, but to dominate. Right? So it isn't just, I'm the boss. It's, I'm the boss to a degree that you have to do everything that I tell you. Right? So actually, what seems to be happening here is we have a church in which a certain group of women have taken over, and they aren't allowing the men to speak. And Paul has to say, no, that's not how this is going to work, right? So I actually want to spend some time unpacking this. The other thing that comes here down at the bottom is there's this weird verse at the end, verse 15. I actually want to go through the passage backwards to unpack it, right? What we read at the end is, but she will be saved through a childbearing. We could also get to this as a sense of kept safe through the process of a childbearing, but I don't think that's what's being said. So it says, but she will be saved through a childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with modesty, right? So the first thing we should point out here, and our English Bibles don't always capture this, the pronouns shift. It begins with a singular, a feminine pronoun, a she. She will be saved through a childbearing, and then it goes to a feminine plural. If they, this is actually, it's talking about a group of women, right? So who's the she and who's the they?
They're all they?
What?
Could they be both men and women?
Well, but it's actually the case that it's in is a feminine case, so it's referring to a group of women. It's a particular. This is something English can't do. Greek has a plural they pronoun that just refers to women. If you want to refer to men, you have a word for that too. And if you refer to a group of people that's mixed, you use the masculine. That's kind of what we tend to do in English too. We can say things like a man, and I mean all people, right? But let's just ask. I mean, you can look at the passage, look a couple of verses above. Who's the she, and then maybe who's the they? Eve. So Eve's got to be the she. It's the only thing it can possibly be. So we're talking about Eve being saved through a childbearing, right? So let's pause with that. What does he do in verses 13 and 14? He gives an argument for that appears at first glance to be there is a hierarchy because Adam was created first. So he seems to go to this place of, because Adam was created first, he's superior, and Adam wasn't the one who was the seed, but the woman. So if you go read the creation story, who eats the apple? Eve. Eve eats it first, right? So Paul is kind of wagging his finger a bit. Hey, you women who have taken over, don't you remember the creation story, right? Eve was the one that was deceived, right? And Adam was made first, right? So we kind of need to unpack what's going on, right? They've somehow taken over. He's going back to the creation story to tell them, hey, you don't get to just take over now and turn everything over, right? But what does he mean by Eve being saved through a childbearing? This is where we have to think like an ancient person, not like a modern people, because he's interpreting things in a style we wouldn't do, right? He's treating Adam and Eve as if they're types. He's not referring to them as actual people. They're like stand-ins for like the representative, right? And how is Eve saved through a childbearing? Well, let's go look at the creation story. So I put Genesis 3 there, right? And the fall. And this is, I'm not going to read all of it, but God comes down to the garden. He's looking for Adam and Eve. He goes, well, where are you? I always think that's good fun, right? And Adam says, I heard you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked. And God says, well, how did you know you were naked? I didn't tell you that, right? And what does Adam do? He blames Eve, right? He says, well, she gave me from the fruit. And then God says, well, what have you done? And she blames the snake, right? And what does God say to the snake? Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. So you'll crawl on your belly. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her offspring and your offspring and hers, he will strike your head and he will strike his heel, right? So Eve is going to be saved by one of her own offspring. Guess who it is? Jesus, right? I mean, this is the argument he's making, right? It's a weird argument. But the argument he's actually making is, how is Eve going to be saved? She's going to be saved because one of her own descendants will be the one who ultimately defeats the snake, the serpent, right? So this is the argument Paul is making, right? But it is kind of a warning to these women of saying, hey, he is kind of calling them out. You guys have kind of taken over in ways that you're not qualified to take over, right? And again, this is the really hard thing here. We not only have to understand difficult arguments, we have to understand the context of what's happening, right? So I call this, whatever we want to call what we're doing here, a class. I've always called it how to read the Bible, right? If there's anything you ever take away from this, it's this. You can't grab a verse in the Bible and just tear it out, right? And say, like, the Bible says X, right? It says X in a context, right? We need to, like, relate it to the whole. So we've got a verse here that's part of a letter. How does it fit in that whole letter? How does that letter fit into the New Testament? How does it fit into the Bible as a whole? You can't just tear it out, right? So what's going on in this church? Well, if we read elsewhere in the Bible, if we go read 2 Timothy, we learn a bit more. So Timothy is in Ephesus. Paul has planted a church there. He said, Timothy, you stay and be their pastor while I go somewhere else, right? And there's problems in this church. And we learn in 2 Timothy that one of the problems is there are false teachers. So if you look at the bottom there, 2 Timothy 3, Paul's talking about these end times are going to be distressing, right? People that's going to, he gives us a list of all the problems in the world and the same problems that we have, right? And then he says, for among them, right, among the people in the church, there are those who make their way into households and captivate immature women, overwhelmed by their sins and swayed by all kinds of desires, who are always studying yet can never be able to recognize truth, right? And there's some other passages that we can piece together. What's happened here is, one, it helps to note, where are these people meeting? I mean, so these early churches, where do they have their worship services? Their houses. They don't have a building, right? A few of them are meeting in synagogues, but for the most part, they're meeting in people's houses. Usually the wealthier people amongst the Christians who have a bigger house, that's where they meet, right? So we have a group of people who have welcomed people that Paul is calling false teachers. They're teaching something different, right? And in fact, if we read first and 2 Timothy as a whole, it seems that one thing that they're teaching is marriage is a bad thing. So don't get married. And you also shouldn't have children. Right? Which is actually, this is a pretty common thing in the ancient world. There's this move to be sort of get out of this, right? To not have attachments, right? If you really think Jesus is going to come back soon, why would you want to do things like have kids and get married, right? So this is what these other people are teaching, and Paul is actually coming and saying, no, they're wrong. This is a false teaching. It's probably a group of young women who have found this sort of new freedom and liberation in this new Christian movement, which is a positive thing, but they've now spun it in this problematic direction. And Paul is coming in to correct them and saying, no, you don't actually understand the gospel. I would encourage you to be quiet and listen. So he is wagging their finger at them a bit in ways that I think are kind of harsh, but it's because he thinks they're wrong. But he's also going to do things like uphold a marriage and a childbirth. These are good things, right? It's not saying you have to do them, but they're not opposed to the gospel. Dale?
When you were talking about their meeting in churches, some women have started to become dominant
Yep.
in some of these house church gatherings. It reminded me, I was, a few years back, I was reading about the Gnostics. And
Yep.
the Gnostics had this view, if I understand it
Yep.
correctly, that there is a deeper experience. You know, you've got this experience where most of the Christians are,
Yep.
and that's good for them. But some of you will be inducted into the mystery.
Yep.
And this is probably better done in a house,
Right.
where they're in a great big
Yeah.
observation. And now you've been inducted into the mysteries, so you know more.
Yeah, so this is exactly what's happening. So and we can actually, there's all kinds of texts. I mean, if you really want to dive deep into this, right, you could spend years doing it. There are people who have. But a perfect example of this Gnosticism is the Gospel of Thomas, which you may have heard of, right? So if you read someone like Marcus Borg, he'll talk about the Gospel of Thomas. Well, it's a Gnostic gospel. It's not a Christian gospel, right? And it's got a lot of the same stories, but they all have a spin to them, right? And in the Gospel of Thomas, I mean, people will read it and say, "Oh, this is good stuff. It's this different picture of Jesus." And I always go to them, "Well, do you really want this Jesus?" One of the things that happens at the end of the Gospel of Thomas is Mary Magdalene is hanging out with Jesus and the disciples after Jesus has risen from the dead. And Peter, I think it's Peter, goes to Jesus and says, "Why is this woman here?" Jesus goes, "Don't worry about it. I'll turn her into a man." Right? Because it actually has this deep antagonism against women, as somehow they're inferior, right? Because Gnosticism does have this idea of the physical body is bad. What's really important about it is our spiritual part. And we're going to ascend the physical world, right? And you get two different forms of it. You get a form that says physical things are bad, abstain from them. So don't have sex, so you don't get married, you don't have kids, you abstain from food, like you are actually pulling away from the physical. The other form says the physical doesn't matter, so indulge it. And you get groups that they have big parties where you eat and eat and eat till you throw up, you have orgies, right? I mean, this is what was happening, right? These are the extremes, right? And Paul's saying, no, the body's important. Jesus rose from the dead in a bodily form. You're going to have a physical body in eternity. It doesn't get sick, right? You're not going to have any problems, but you still are a physical form, right? The physical body matters, right? And so this is what he's trying to split. So he's fighting against these Gnostic ideas, right? Which it seems like some of these people have picked up, right?
When we're going to have bodies, this is going a bit afield, I suppose.
Yeah.
But at one point, Jesus tells the scribes or the Sadducees, we will not be given in marriage in the afterlife. So this question of whose wife will she be is not important. But then I find myself wondering, but will we be masculine and feminine? Will we make our gender into eternity? And I'm thinking here also of Paralandra and C.S. Lewis, where we have this very strong play on masculinity and femininity and a dance, that the whole of creation is this dance of masculinity.
Right. So on this, this is where I think people are, how to put this? Lots of people think that the conversations we are currently having in our society about gender and transgenderism or whatever, all these things are new. Not at all, right? I mean, this is, I guess, the PhD level of this conversation, but if you go read, I mean, big name theologians like the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, they're having this argument about the afterlife. So there's a bunch of important figures. So there are the people who wrote the Council of, the Nicene Creed in the East. They're arguing about, will we have a gender in heaven? And most of them think we won't. Think we'll be asexual, because we won't need sexual organs, because we won't be reproducing. So they're unnecessary, right? Then you also get people like Augustine, who argues, well, actually my gender is so much part of who I am that I can't imagine being a me in the afterlife if I'm still not a male or if I'm still not a female, right? So they're arguing about these things really intensely 1,500 or more years ago. The conversations we're having now are not new, right? I mean, we've been arguing about this for a very, very long time, right? Yeah. Okay. Right, there we go, right? Right. But I think that's worth pointing out. I mean, all of these kinds of conversations, and different ones too, that we're having, they're having them in the ancient world. We've just kind of trained ourselves to think that this is new, or we read very selectively. But I mean, they're having all of these arguments. Yep.
What about, this is a little bit away from what we're talking about, but what about the theory that Luke was written by a woman?
I mean, the problem with that is we just don't know, right? But
it is.
It's a possibility. I mean, but again, there's also people who think he has to be a doctor because Luke is identified as a doctor elsewhere, but he actually doesn't use medical terms any more than anyone else,
well,
right?
He was a theologian. What do you think?
I mean, this is none of the Gospels actually tell us who wrote them. So we say the Gospel according to Matthew or Luke. Those are titles given to them a good 100 years afterwards. Right? We just know. Like, what we do have is early church by the late 2nd century already calling them the Gospel of Matthew or Mark or Luke, and giving us stories at least of who they think wrote them. Right? That's all that we have. I think the tradition is probably right, because we simply don't have any counter evidence. But the honest answer is we don't know. Right? What we can tell is that they get associated with communities really quick. I mean, Mark's gospel comes out of Rome, where Mark was, and where Peter was. Matthew's gospel comes out of Syria, which is where we're told Matthew went. Right? Luke's gospel seems, the difference with the gospel of Luke is he probably wrote Luke and Acts. When you read them in the original, it's fine literature written by a native speaker. The other ones, if you know Greek, like I read Mark and I go, it's kind of like, it's the experience of reading a paper from one of the graduate students who English isn't their first language. It's good, they're smart, but they make silly mistakes. Right? Mark makes silly mistakes in Greek because it's not his first language. Right? So these are the kinds of things that we can tell. But we don't actually have. There's no autographed copy of any of these things. Yeah.
I just can't read. What about Hebrews?
Hebrew. Yeah.
Think that Hebrews was written by a woman. Maybe
Priscilla is the argument, right? And again, we don't have any evidence of who wrote it, right? Other than that, it's a person who knows the Jewish faith and the Old Testament very, very, very well, right? So it's a highly educated person, right? Again, this is the thing of we I mean, whether you're progressive or conservative, both sides tend to assume that we know more than we actually do. And we should just be comfortable with we don't know. Ultimately, why does it matter? Right? We have this text before us. The church has identified it as part of the Bible, and we give it authority. Right? I mean, this is a kind of an aside. It's quite clear to most scholars that we get these books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But elsewhere there's a hint that Paul wrote a 3rd letter. But most scholars think we have the 1st one and the 3rd. And we just lost the 2nd one. They didn't copy it. Right? What would we do if we found it?
Still in the caves.
Well, it could be, but I mean, maybe it is, right? But if we found it, like, it wouldn't just instantly go in the Bible, right? We'd have to have like a big conference, and people would have to vote on it, right? I mean, that's how it would work, right? And we couldn't possibly agree anymore because the church is so split, right? But part of it is just the humility of saying we don't have answers to some of these questions. What can we answer, and how do we do that? We do that by saying we can tell roughly when these texts were written. We can tell where they were from. So if we put them into that world, what do we learn, right? And again, part of this is we can't bring our assumptions to this. I mean, this isn't written in a person who lives in a democracy in the 21st century. It's written to someone who lives in an empire in the first, which is highly patriarchal, in which slavery is normative, right? In which there isn't any hint of the economic systems that we have, right? So we have to put it in that world and then figure out how does it speak to us, right? That's hard. And the problem we constantly get ourselves into is we think the Bible's easy, right? And we can just read it off the page, right? That shouldn't discourage us. It should encourage us to say, let's keep reading and studying and do what we can, right? We don't have time for the Ephesians, obviously. I just think what I want to finish highlighting about 1 Timothy is he isn't saying women can't have authority. He's saying women can't take over and exclude the men. Right? He's also saying, in particular, the group of women that have taken over this church, he basically calls them uneducated. And part of what he's doing, he says immature. The word there, immature, could also be translated something close to mindless. He kind of insults them. But his point is they don't know what they're talking about because they've come under the influence of these false teachers, right? The whole way that passage works is don't listen to the Eve who was tempted and sinned. Listen to the Adam. What is he saying? He's saying, listen to me and Timothy, right? But he isn't at all saying women can't speak, right? That's just not what it says. He's saying rather give them the space they need to go learn the right way. And the whole thing is trained, if we go back up to the top, of basically do things appropriately, right? Because how does he begin? He wants the men to stop arguing with each other and to go pray, verse 8. Verse 9, he says, women address appropriately with modesty and good sense. I mean, again, what Paul's really anxious about it seems, is people have found this new freedom of, I don't have to follow these old cultural rules anymore, right? But they're taking it to an extreme. And there's also this idea here of, if you're wealthy, great, don't show it off. Right? Because the church is supposed to be about equals, not this hierarchy. He's actually trying to undo hierarchies based on things like class and gender. Right? That's what I got for today. We gotta go. We'll do. You can keep your hand out. I'll bring one more next week. We'll talk about that Ephesians passage because that's another big key one. And then the next couple of weeks we're going to talk about even talking about God. Do we always have to use masculine terms for God? And then we'll dive in a bit into some contemporary issues. So, see you next week.